Working nights at the behavioral hospital taught me one crucial lesson. If things are calm, it won't last. And that night was no exception. It was well past midnight, the time when the unit usually settled into a quiet hum of sleep and occasional murmurs. I was making my rounds when I checked in on Mrs. Jensen, an elderly patient with advanced dementia who had been restless all evening. She was one of those patients who could turn from sweet and confused to unexpectedly combative in the blink of an eye, so I approached her door cautiously. "Mrs. Jensen," I called softly, opening the door just a crack to let the faint glow of the hallway spill into the dim room. At first, I didn't see her. The bed was empty, the blankets rumpled, but there was no sign of her. Then she appeared. From the shadows near her bed, she rose slowly, her thin frame trembling, her gray hair sticking out in wild tufts like a mad scientist. The sight was jarring, like something out of a horror movie. And then she screamed. It wasn't just a scream. It was a piercing, blood-curdling shriek that sent shivers down my spine. The sound echoed down the hallway, waking up half the unit. Doors creaked open, and confused patients peered out, drawn by the chaos. I barely had time to react before things escalated. Mrs. Jensen, still screaming, suddenly started peeing. Right there in the middle of the room, standing stock still, urine pooling around her bare feet. It was like something out of The Exorcist. "Mrs. Jensen," I said as calmly as I could, trying not to let the sheer absurdity of the moment get to me. But before I could take another step, she bolted, right through the puddle of pee, her feet splashing as she lunged straight at me. Her grip was like a vice. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin with surprising strength for someone her size. Her eyes were wild as she shook me, screaming, "Sally, I know you're working with Frank. You're not going to get away with it." I froze for a moment, trying to process what was happening. "Mrs. Jensen," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I'm not Sally. You've got the wrong person. Please, let go." But she wasn't listening. She tightened her grip, yelling, "I'm not touching you," even as her nails dug deeper into my arm. By this point, the commotion had drawn a couple of techs to the room. Mike, one of the more seasoned techs, stepped in, his face a mix of concern and confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing between me and Mrs. Jensen, who was still clinging to my arm like her life depended on it. "She thinks I'm someone named Sally," I said, struggling to keep my voice calm. Mike stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation, but as he approached, his foot landed squarely in the puddle of pee. His face twisted in horror as he tried to step back, but it was too late. His foot slipped out from under him, and he went down hard, landing flat on his back in the middle of the puddle. For a split second, everything was silent. Even Mrs. Jensen paused her screaming to turn and look at Mike, sprawled out on the floor. Then her face lit up with recognition, or at least her version of it. "Frank," she shrieked, pointing at him. Mike groaned, sitting up slowly. "I'm not Frank, ma'am," he said, trying to keep the irritation out of his voice. But Mrs. Jensen wasn't buying it. She let go of my arm and lunged toward Mike. "You're working with her," she screamed. "You're both trying to steal from me." Mike scrambled backward, slipping again in the puddle as Mrs. Jensen advanced on him. That's when Sarah, another tech, appeared in the doorway. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. The puddle, Mike flailing on the floor, and Mrs. Jensen charging toward him. "What the hell is going on in here?" Sarah asked, but there was no time for explanations. Mrs. Jensen reached for her walker, gripping it with both hands. With surprising speed, she lifted it and swung it toward Mike like a weapon. "Okay, Mrs. Jensen, that's enough," Sarah said, stepping in quickly and grabbing the walker before it could connect. Her voice was calm but commanding, the kind of tone that often worked with confused patients. Mrs. Jensen hesitated, her wild eyes darting between Sarah, Mike, and me. For a moment, I thought she might fight back, but then her shoulders slumped. "They're everywhere," she muttered, her voice breaking. "Frank and Sally, they're everywhere." Sarah and I guided her gently back to her bed, speaking softly to reassure her. She sat down without further resistance, her energy seemingly spent. "You're safe, Mrs. Jensen," I said, kneeling in front of her. "Frank and Sally aren't here. We're just here to help you." She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine. Then she sighed, her entire body deflating. "I'm tired," she whispered, lying back down and closing her eyes. Mike, still damp and clearly over the entire ordeal, stood up slowly, shaking his head. As he left the room, he muttered, "Me too,"